The Science of Shadows, a History of Forensic Psychology. The Science of Shadows, a History of Forensic Psychology. Introduction. Before the textbooks were written, before the FBI built its training academy in Quantico, before anyone thought to call it profiling, there were simply people who looked at the aftermath of violence and asked, what kind of mind would do this? The road to that question winds through gaslit London streets, academic lecture halls in New England, and a psychiatrist's office in Greenwich Village. It's a story of intuition hardening into science, of brilliant minds working at the edges of their disciplines, of failures and breakthroughs that shaped how we catch killers today. This is how we learned to read the stories written in blood. Part 1. The Surgeon and the Ripper. London, 1888. The fog that rolled off the Thames each evening seemed almost theatrical, a grim stage dressing for what unfolded in the streets of Whitechapel. The district was a labyrinth of narrow alleys and cramped tenements, home to the city's poorest, sweatshop workers, dock hands, and women who sold the only thing they had left to sell. Between August and November, 5 women were murdered. Their bodies were found in courtyards and doorways, throats cut, abdomens opened, organs removed, with what could only be described as anatomical knowledge. The press called him Jack the Ripper. The police called him a phantom. And the public, caught between fascination and terror, bought newspapers by the thousands, hungry for any detail that might explain the unexplainable. Dr. Thomas Bond was a police surgeon, a man who'd spent decades examining the dead. He'd seen stabbings and beatings, the ordinary violence of a rough city. But this was different. The precision of the cuts, the specific organs taken, the pattern of the wounds, these spoke of someone who knew where to cut, but not necessarily how to control what happened after. On November 10th, after the 5th and final canonical victim, Mary Jane Kelly, Bond sat down to write a report. The Metropolitan Police had asked for his medical opinion. What they got instead was something no one had ever produced before. The murderer, Bond wrote, must have been a man of solitary habits, subject to periodical attacks of homicidal and erotic mania. The shape of the wounds indicates a man who is physically strong but not necessarily large. He would be quiet and inoffensive in his daily life, perhaps middle-aged, and would wear a cloak or overcoat to conceal bloodstains. It was a portrait drawn from flesh and blood. Bond had examined each body, noting not just what had been done, but the manner in which it was done, the hesitation marks, the depth of the cuts, the positioning of the corpse. He understood that violence leaves fingerprints on the mind as clearly as it does on skin. The police followed his advice. They interviewed men who fit the profile, loners, middle-aged, with medical or anatomical knowledge. No arrest was ever made. The Ripper vanished as mysteriously as he'd appeared. But Bond's report survived. Tucked away in files and footnotes, it waited for someone to recognize what it truly was. The first known criminal profile. A doctor had looked at the dead and described the living man who'd made them that way. The Science of Shadows had begun. Part 2. The Professor and the Witness. Hugo Münsterberg arrived in America in 1892, a German psychologist with a medical degree and an ambition larger than the Atlantic he'd crossed. He'd been hired by William James to run the psychology laboratory at Harvard, a position that should have confined him to academia's quiet halls. Münsterberg had other plans. Psychology in his era was a young science, barely removed from philosophy, still struggling to prove it belonged among the real sciences. Laboratories measured reaction times and sensory thresholds. Researchers mapped the boundaries of perception, but Münsterberg kept returning to a different question. What does any of this mean for how people actually live? He found his answer in the courtroom. In 1906, he served as an expert witness in a murder trial. The defendant claimed insanity, and Münsterberg was asked to evaluate him. He spent hours in conversation with the accused, administering tests, observing behavior, and finally testifying that the man was not insane, but rather a calculating liar who understood perfectly well what he'd done. The jury disagreed. They found the defendant insane, and Münsterberg was ridiculed in the press as a charlatan playing at medicine. He could have retreated to the laboratory. Instead, he doubled down. On the witness stand appeared in 1908 a book that would lay the groundwork for everything that followed. Münsterberg argued that psychology had profound applications in legal proceedings, that witness testimony was far less reliable than the courts assumed, that false confessions were common, that jury decisions were influenced by biases and emotions the jurors themselves didn't recognize. He described experiments he'd conducted, showing how easily memory could be corrupted. He wrote about the suggestibility of witnesses, how leading questions could implant false details, how confidence in one's memory often bore no relationship to its accuracy. He criticized the legal system for relying on methods, like cross-examination, that often obscured truth rather than revealing it. The legal establishment was furious. Judges dismissed him as an interloper. Attorneys mocked his accent and his academic pretensions. A prominent legal scholar wrote that psychologists should stay in their laboratories and leave the courts to those who understand how the world actually works. Münsterberg didn't live to see his ideas take hold. He died in 1916, still arguing for a science of the mind that could serve the cause of justice. But the seed was planted. The questions he asked about memory, deception, and the limits of human perception would echo through every interrogation room and courtroom for the next century. He had no way of knowing that one day police would routinely consult psychologists, or that his work would be cited in Supreme Court decisions, or that the very methods he championed would become standard practice. The professor had stepped out of the laboratory. The law would never be the same. Part 3. The Bomber and the Psychiatrist. New York, 1940. A pipe bomb exploded in the Consolidated Edison power plant on West 64th Street. No one was hurt. The device was crude, wrapped in a paper sleeve, and it had been placed in a location where it would cause minimal damage. Someone was sending a message. Over the next 16 years, more than 30 bombs would be planted across New York City. Most exploded. Some didn't. Several were placed in public landmarks, the Grand Central Terminal, the New York Public Library, the Radio City Music Hall. Others targeted Con Edison facilities. A few were mailed to individuals. Miraculously, no one was killed. The bomber seemed to want it that way. His devices were almost theatrical, designed to terrify rather than destroy. He sent letters to the police, written in neat, precise script, signed with the initials FP. The NYPD established a special unit. Detectives worked the case for years, following leads, interviewing suspects, analyzing the bombs for fingerprints or physical evidence. They found nothing. The bomber was a ghost. By 1956, the city was on edge. The press had dubbed him the Mad Bomber, and every unattended package became a potential threat. Police Commissioner Stephen Kennedy was under intense pressure to solve the case before someone finally got killed. He decided to try something unconventional. Dr. James A. Brussels was a psychiatrist in private practice, a soft-spoken man with a clinical approach to the human mind. He'd consulted on criminal cases before, evaluating defendants for competency and insanity. but he'd never been asked to describe someone he'd never met. The detectives brought him a stack of files, crime scene photographs, copies of the letters, bomb fragments. They told him what they knew, which was almost nothing. Brussels settled into the work. He read the letters first, noting the careful penmanship, the precise grammar, the recurring phrases. FP. What did it mean? The bomber had mentioned an injustice, a wrong done to him that he wanted acknowledged. He wrote about being victimized and betrayed. The bombs themselves told their own story. They were constructed with care, almost lovingly, each component chosen and placed with precision. But they weren't designed for maximum destruction. Many had been placed in ways that ensured they would be discovered before detonation, or that would limit casualties when they did explode. This was not a man who wanted to kill. This was a man who wanted to be heard. Brussels began to write. The bomber is a male, between 40 and 50 years old. He is unmarried, possibly living with female relatives, a mother, an aunt, or a sister. He is of Eastern European descent, likely Polish or Slavic. He is paranoid, but not schizophrenic. His delusions are focused on a specific grievance rather than a general break with reality. He is neat, meticulous, probably well-educated, though he may work with his hands. He has a mechanical or engineering background. He is deeply resentful of Consolidated Edison, which he believes wronged him in some way. And he will be wearing a double-breasted suit when you arrest him. The detectives were skeptical. A double-breasted suit? How could anyone possibly know that? Brussels explained. The bomber's letters showed a fastidious personality, someone who cared about appearances and presentation. The careful construction of the bombs suggested a man who took pride in his work, who wanted it to be appreciated. Men of that era who cared about presentation wore suits, and the double-breasted style was popular among Eastern European immigrants. It was formal, dignified, a statement of respectability. It was educated guesswork, the application of psychological principles to physical evidence. The detectives had nothing to lose. They dug into Con Edison's employment records, searching for anyone who'd been terminated or injured under questionable circumstances. They found a file for a man named George Metesky, a Polish immigrant who'd worked as a mechanic for the company. In 1931, he'd been injured in a workplace accident, a steam explosion that left him temporarily disabled. He claimed the company was at fault. They disputed his account. He was fired. Metesky had filed for workers' compensation and been denied. He'd written letters of complaint that went unanswered. He'd grown increasingly bitter, convinced that the company had destroyed his health and his future. The detectives went to his home in Waterbury, Connecticut. A woman answered the door. His sister. Metesky was in his bedroom, she said. They knocked. He opened the door. George Metesky was 52 years old, unmarried, living with his two sisters, of Polish descent, a former mechanic with a grudge against Con Edison. And he was wearing a double-breasted suit, he confessed within hours. The initials FP stood for fair play, what he believed he'd never received. He'd built the bombs in his basement, working methodically, planning each placement, sending his letters to the police and the press. He'd wanted someone to acknowledge what had been done to him. 16 years of terror, all because no one had listened. Metesky was found legally insane and committed to a mental hospital where he lived out the rest of his days. The Mad Bomber case was closed. But something else had opened. James Brussels had demonstrated that psychological analysis could identify an unknown offender from nothing but crime scene evidence and behavioral patterns. The newspapers called it psychic detection. Brussels corrected them. It was simply the application of clinical knowledge to human behavior. Whatever it was called, law enforcement took notice. The age of profiling had begun. Part 4. The Agents and the Killers. Quantico, Virginia, 1972. The FBI Academy sat on a Marine Corps base, a cluster of buildings where new agents learned to shoot, to investigate, to uphold the Bureau's standards. In a small office on the 3rd floor of the main building, 2 agents were about to change everything. Howard Tetton had been a police officer in California before joining the FBI. He'd developed an interest in the psychology of offenders, reading everything he could find, building his own theories about what motivated criminals. When he transferred to Quantico as an instructor, he found an ally in Patrick Mullaney, a former priest-turned-FBI agent with a master's degree in psychology. They called it the Behavioral Science Unit, a name that sounded vaguely scientific without committing to anything specific. Their mandate was to study the behavior of criminals and apply that knowledge to ongoing investigations. What that actually meant, they would have to figure out for themselves. Tetton and Mullaney started with what they had: case files, crime scene photographs, and their own observations. But they quickly realized that the best source of information was the criminals themselves. In 1975, they began conducting structured interviews with incarcerated offenders, rapists, arsonists, and, most significantly, serial killers. Robert Ressler joined the unit around this time, a young agent with a particular interest in repeat offenders. He was the one who coined the term serial killer, borrowing it from British television programming, where stories were told in successive episodes. John Douglas arrived shortly after, bringing an intensity and ambition that would drive the program forward. They interviewed dozens of men. Edmund Kemper, who'd killed his grandparents at 15, then murdered 6 young women and his own mother. Charles Manson, who'd orchestrated one of the most notorious murder sprees in American history. David Berkowitz, the son of Sam, John Wayne Gacy, Ted Bundy. Each interview was a dissection. The agents asked about childhood, about fantasies, about the moments before and after the crimes. They wanted to know how these men thought, what drove them, what patterns repeated across different offenders. What emerged was a taxonomy of violence. They classified offenders as organized or disorganized, a distinction that would become fundamental to profiling. Organized offenders planned their crimes, brought tools, selected victims carefully, and cleaned up afterward. They were often intelligent, socially competent, and employed. Disorganized offenders acted spontaneously, used weapons of opportunity, left evidence behind, and often lived alone on the margins of society. This wasn't just academic categorization. It had practical applications. If a crime scene showed organized characteristics, investigators could expect a suspect who fit a certain profile, employed, possibly in a position of trust, likely to own a vehicle. If the scene was disorganized, they could expect someone different, socially isolated, possibly mentally ill, likely to have a criminal record for lesser offenses. The agents developed the concept of signature, the unique behaviors that reflected a killer's psychological needs, distinct from the modus operandi, which was simply the practical method of committing the crime. A signature was what the offender had to do to satisfy something inside himself. It was the fingerprint of the psyche. They applied their methods to active cases, often with striking results. In 1980, Douglas profiled the killer of a 12-year-old girl in Atlanta, predicting that the offender would be a white male, late 20s to early 30s, with a history of violent crime and a connection to the area where the body was found. The killer turned out to be a white male, 31 years old, with a prior assault conviction, who lived 3 blocks from the crime scene. The successes made headlines. The failures were less publicized, a wrongful conviction here, a misleading profile there. The science was young, and its practitioners were still learning its limits. But the behavioral science unit had proved something fundamental. The mind of a criminal could be studied, understood, and anticipated. What Thomas Bond had intuited in London, what James Brussels had demonstrated in New York, the FBI had institutionalized in Virginia. The agents had turned psychology into a weapon. They'd taught law enforcement to see what the evidence was trying to show them, that every crime is a communication, a message written in actions rather than words, and that the key to catching the messenger is learning to read what he's saying. Epilogue. Today, forensic psychology is a recognized discipline practiced by thousands of professionals around the world. It has matured beyond its early intuitions, incorporating statistical analysis, cognitive science, and rigorous research methods. It remains imperfect, a tool, not a crystal ball, but it has changed the way investigations are conducted. The story continues. New questions arise with each case. And somewhere, a detective and a psychologist are sitting across from each other, looking at photographs and asking, what kind of mind would do this? The answer is out there, waiting to be read.